Right here we have the skull. What do we call the front part of the skull? Frontal bone. What do we call the upper jaw? That's called the maxilla. Lower jaw we call the mandible. If you look at an angle right here, what do we call this? Angle of the mandible. Right in front is the body of the mandible. What is up here? The cheekbone we call the zygomatic bone. Suture right here separates frontal from the two parietals. We call that the coronal suture. Suture right by the ear canal, square shape, separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone. What do we call this suture? Squamous suture. What is this? That's the mastoid process. If you work a little bit inwards, you probably can't see it if you want to zoom up. That's the styloid process. What suture separates the two parietal bones? What do we call that? That's called the sagittal suture. What suture separates the two parietal from the occipital bone? That's the lambdoid suture. Come up closer. What do we have at the base of the skull right here? And I don't know if you can see it where I'm pointing to. Is that C1 or C2? C1 we call the atlas. What bone is this? C2 we call the axis, which has a vertical projection, we call the dens. Then we have C3, 4, C5, C6, C7. How many bones make up the thoracic spine? 12. How do we know we're in the thoracic spine? You can see we have ribs present. Also, if you look on the side, these are the spinous processes projecting backwards. You can see the spinous process is long, going downward at an angle. So what bone is this? This is your scapula, specifically the back part of the scapula. What do we call this? This is your spine of the scapula. Anything above the spine of the scapula, we call the supraspinous fossa. Anything below the spine of the scapula, we call the infraspinous fossa. Here's the spine, so we call this the medial border of the scapula, lateral border of the actual scapula. So going back to the thoracic spine, we have 12 bones that make up the thoracic spine. How do we know we're in the lumbar spine? If you can see, we have the spinous process. If you look at it, it's going to be a box shape to it. So that's your lumbar spine. What bone is this? That is your sacrum. What you can see we have, it's called the median sacral crest. It's a vertical projection. Automatically, when you see this vertical projection, these are called the posterior sacral foramina. And then the tailbone, what do we call the tailbone? That's called the coccyx. Top of the hip, top of the pelvis, we call that the iliac crest. Let's turn this actually around. What you can actually see, let's actually go back up. This large bump, we call the greater tubercle. Smaller bump, a little bit inwards, we call the lesser tubercle. This bone collectively, we call that the humerus. What is this? This is part of the scapula, we call the coracoid process. That's projecting forward. If you look at this, what's this depression which forms the shoulder joint? We call that the glenoid cavity, also known as the glenoid fossa. So what is this? That's the humeral head. And remember with the humeral head, we had an anatomical neck versus surgical neck. Which one wrapped around the humeral head? No, is that the anatomical or surgical? Which one wrapped around the shaft of the bone? So what bone is this? Clavicle, collarbone. How do you find the acromion process? Find the spine of the scapula and work laterally. Here is your acromion process. So looking at this, what is the cheekbone called? Yep, zygomatic arch, zygomatic bone. You know, this is the forehead, frontal bone, mandible, maxilla. Looking at the sternum, you have the jugular notch, manubrium, body of the sternum, and then the xiphoid process. So all of this collectively we call the breastbone, also known as the sternum. So working yourself down, we have, what do we call the thigh bone? Femur. How can you identify the difference between the humerus and the femur? We have a large projection right here on the femur we call the greater trochanter. So greater trochanter is going to be located lateral, a lot larger compared to the greater tubercle. So here's the greater tubercle, lesser tubercle of the humerus. Greater trochanter, lesser you can't see, but it's going to be this bump right on the inside. So greater trochanter, and then your thigh bone we call the femur. Looking at the humerus, what comes off of the humerus? Radius and the ulna. So how do we know the difference between the radius and ulna? Which one had this U-shaped notch right here?
The ulna.
Ulna. This U-shaped notch right here, we call that the trochlear notch. When you hit your funny bone, you're hitting right here on the ulna. We call the olecranon process, also known as the olecranon. So here's the trochlear notch. Here's the olecranon of the, what bone is this? Ulna. It's on the pinky side. So what bone is this?
Radius.
On the thumb side? The radius. So radius, thumb side, ulna, pinky side, but to determine radius versus ulna, the ulna has that, starts with a U, it has that U-shaped notch called the trochlear notch. Looking at the hand, how do we know digit 1 versus digit 5? Here's digit 1, which is the thumb. Digit 2, middle finger is digit 3. Digit 4, ring finger, and then digit 5, the actual pinky. So when you look at the thumb, we have a distal phalanx and only a proximal phalanx. So put a lot of stars next to this bone called the proximal phalanx. When you look at the pointer finger, we have the distal phalanx, middle phalanx, proximal phalanx, then middle finger, distal, middle, proximal, and then distal, middle, proximal, distal, middle, proximal. So thumb lacks middle phalanx, instead it has distal phalanx and a proximal phalanx. So when looking at the wrist bones, carpal bones, most commonly fractured carpal bone, we start off on the thumb side, proximal row, so we have scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, which is underneath, it's this bone underneath, and then what's sitting on top of the triquetrum, which is boulder-shaped. That's called, it starts with the P, the pisiform. So scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum underneath, and then pisiform right above that. That they can't handle, trapezium, trapezoid, rectangular capitate, and then what bone is this that has a hook to it? The hamate. So let's go over this. So we have scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, and then this rectangular capitate and the hook of the hamate. What bone is this? If we just point to this, that's the radius because it's towards the thumb side. What bone is this? Towards the pinky, the actual ulna. Looking at the actual hip, this is your femoral head. What does it sit into? What do we call the depression in the pelvis? Starts with an acetabulum. So acetabulum, basically it's that depression inside the actual pelvis. When looking at the actual lower parts, what do we call this? Patella, your kneecap. What do we call this large bone right here?
Is it tibia?
Yep, so tibia, and then we have towards the small toe side, the actual fibula. Fibula is located lateral, tibia is located more medial. So when looking at the actual foot, what you can see, the heel bone, what do we call the heel bone? All of this. That starts with a C, that's called the calcaneus. What's sitting on top of the calcaneus? This bone we call the talus or the talus. Big toe. So what bone is, I don't know if you can see it, this bone right here we call the navicular. This bone we call the, what bone? Cube-shaped?
Cuboid.
Cuboid. In front of the navicular bone you have the medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, and lateral cuneiform. So that's it. Let's go over